I have covered crises for years. Coups, wars, collapses that were supposed to change the world and then quietly didn't. But I have never seen anything unfold like this. Not at this speed, not with this level of systemic failure happening all at once. This is not a protest cycle. This is not another round of unrest that gets crushed, buried, and forgotten. What is happening in Tehran right now looks, sounds, and moves like something far more dangerous to those in power: irreversibility. Ask yourself a simple question. When was the last time a regime tried to convince the world it was strong by turning the lights off? That alone tells you everything you need to know. Because strong systems don't panic in the dark. Strong systems don't pull kill switches. Strong systems don't behave like hunted animals. And yet, here we are. Over the span of roughly 48 hours, reports indicate that Tehran crossed the threshold that authoritarian systems are designed never to cross. Control of the streets fractured, then slipped, then in key areas vanished entirely. According to multiple accounts circulating from inside and outside the country, crowds numbering in the hundreds of thousands, possibly exceeding 1 million, flooded major arteries, blocked highways, and converged on symbolic and operational centers of state power. That matters, not because of the number alone, but because of where and how it happened. This wasn't random. This wasn't spontaneous noise. This wasn't what regimes like to call isolated rioting. This was concentration, timing, choke points, strategic streets, administrative zones. And that changes the equation completely. The trigger didn't come out of nowhere. It rarely does. For years, Iran has been sitting on layered pressure: economic suffocation, environmental collapse, demographic exhaustion, and a legitimacy crisis that never healed after repeated crackdowns. What changed in early January wasn't the grievance. It was the calculation of fear. When people decide they have less to lose by moving than by staying still, systems start to crack. By the night of January 9th, according to numerous reports, sections of Tehran, including historically sensitive corridors, were no longer under effective regime control. Protesters didn't just march through them, they held them. And holding territory, even briefly, sends a message that echoes far beyond that street. That message is simple: the state is no longer omnipresent. The regime's response followed a familiar authoritarian script: first denial, then minimization, then digital suffocation. Internet traffic reportedly dropped to near zero across wide swaths of the capital and surrounding provinces. The logic is old and crude. If no one can see it, it didn't happen. But this isn't 2009. It's not even 2019. Satellite connectivity, VPN tunnels, external relays. The blackout didn't erase the story. It amplified it. To outside observers, the shutdown didn't signal control. It signaled panic. It told the world that whatever was happening inside was something the regime didn't want witnessed. And here's the critical point many miss. Regimes don't cut communications when they're winning. They cut communications when they're afraid of what their own actions will look like. This brings us to the real structure of the conflict. Not the slogans, not the flags, but the opposing forces underneath. On one side, you have a state built on coercive durability, a system that survives not because it is loved, but because it is feared. Its spine is the security apparatus, the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, the intelligence ministries, and a clerical elite that has fused theology with force. This structure is designed to absorb unrest, fragment opposition, and outlast outrage. On the other side, you now have something qualitatively different from past protest waves. This isn't just students. It isn't just workers. It isn't just the urban middle class. What reports suggest is a cross-section of Iranian society moving simultaneously: North and South Tehran, affluent districts and working-class neighborhoods, secular youth and religious families pushed past endurance. When that alignment happens, repression becomes exponentially harder. Because the regime's traditional playbook relies on division: isolate the protesters, label them foreign-backed, wait for exhaustion to set in. That playbook collapses when the people in the street look like the people in the security forces' own homes. And that's where the real danger lies for the system. The villain, if we can call it that, is not a single man or even a single institution. It's an architecture of power that has consumed economic resources, water supplies, and political oxygen to sustain itself. The IRGC is not just a military force. It's an economic empire. The clerical elite is not just religious. It's administrative. Together, they've turned the state into a mechanism for survival of the regime rather than survival of the population. The victims are easier to identify: They're the people paying for mismanagement with empty reservoirs, collapsing currency, and futures that keep shrinking. They're the shop owners whose businesses die under sanctions and corruption, the workers whose wages evaporate with inflation, the families who now see protest not as ideology, but as necessity. This is not a morality play. It's a collision between a system that demands obedience and a society that has run out of margin. And when that collision happens at scale, when fear flips sides, something irreversible begins. Because once people discover that the state can be pushed back, even temporarily, the myth of inevitability dies. And authoritarian systems, more than anything else, rely on that myth. What we are witnessing now is not the end. That's never guaranteed. History is cruel that way. But it may very well be the end of certainty. The certainty that this regime will always prevail, always repress, always outlast. And once that certainty is gone, everything else becomes negotiable. Underneath the emotion, beneath the smoke and the slogans, what determines the fate of moments like this is logic. Cold, mechanical logic. Revolutions don't succeed because people are angry. They succeed when systems stop functioning. And right now, multiple systems inside Iran appear to be failing at the same time. The first failure is spatial control. Authoritarian power depends on predictable geography, streets that can be sealed, intersections that can be cleared, crowds that can be dispersed before they merge. What has reportedly unfolded in Tehran breaks that model. When tens or hundreds of thousands of people converge on the same arteries, not randomly, but deliberately, the math turns brutal. No internal security force is built to control 1 million bodies moving as one. Not sustainably, not without catastrophic bloodshed. And even bloodshed has limits. According to multiple reports, security forces were stretched across too many flashpoints at once. When that happens, doctrine collapses. Units are forced to react instead of dominate. Checkpoints become liabilities. Armored vehicles become isolated targets. The psychological shift is subtle but lethal. The hunters start to feel watched. That's when a security apparatus begins to lose initiative, the most precious currency it has. The second failure is informational control. The blackout was supposed to suffocate momentum. Instead, it became a confession. When the Ministry of Communications reportedly shut down core internet infrastructure, traffic graphs dropping to near zero, the intent was clear: operate without witnesses. But the outcome was the opposite. Alternative channels, satellite links, external relays, improvised networks appear to have kept information flowing outward. And here's the irony authoritarian regimes never fully grasp. Visibility isn't just about exposure, it's about morale. The blackout didn't just alert the world, it told the protesters something crucial, that the regime was afraid of what would be seen if the light stayed on. That knowledge travels fast, faster than slogans. The third failure is economic continuity. States don't fall when people protest, they fall when money stops moving. Reports of coordinated strikes, particularly among oil workers and bazaar merchants, signal a dangerous escalation. The bazaar isn't just an economic space in Iran, it's a political barometer. Historically, when merchants close their doors en masse, it reflects not chaos, but consensus. It means capital no longer believes the system can protect it. Oil, of course, is the regime's bloodstream. Even temporary disruptions send shockwaves through state finances. According to economic observers, export bottlenecks and strike actions have contributed to currency volatility severe enough to strain payrolls, including for security forces themselves. That matters more than any speech. A regime can demand loyalty. It cannot print it. When salaries don't arrive, ideology erodes quickly. The fourth failure is internal cohesion. One of the most dangerous moments for any authoritarian system is when its coercive arms hesitate. Even limited refusal, a checkpoint that stands down, a unit that delays, a commander who avoids escalation, sends a signal that fear is no longer absolute. Reports suggesting that some police or local security elements decline to confront protesters or quietly disengaged should not be exaggerated, but they should not be ignored. Authoritarian power is brittle. It depends on the assumption of unanimous compliance. Once that assumption cracks, distrust spreads upward fast. That's when elites start calculating exits. Which brings us to the fifth failure, elite confidence. In moments like this, private behavior tells the truth that public statements conceal. Increased activity at airports, quiet departures, assets moved, families relocated. None of this proves collapse, but it proves doubt. And doubt at the top is corrosive. Now layer these failures together: spatial, informational, economic, institutional, and the picture becomes clearer. This is not a single crisis, it's a convergence. And convergence is what systems fear most. Of course, none of this exists without evidence, and evidence in environments like this must be handled carefully. Numbers matter, but precision is dangerous. Crowd estimates of 1.5 million should be treated as approximations, drawn from multiple on-the-ground accounts and visual assessments, rather than verified census methods. Claims of facility seizures or burned headquarters require corroboration and cautious language. Allegations of nuclear threats or foreign military readiness must be framed as reports, not facts. Why does that matter? Because credibility is power, and moments like this attract exaggeration as quickly as they attract hope. Still, even with conservative framing, the data points form a troubling pattern for the regime. Internet shutdowns confirmed by traffic monitors, currency depreciation visible on open markets, strikes acknowledged indirectly by state media through denials, symbolic shifts, flags, slogans, iconography, captured repeatedly across different cities. Symbols aren't decorations, they're diagnostics. When people replace state symbols with older or alternative ones, they're not just rejecting leadership, they're rejecting the narrative that justifies that leadership's existence. That is a deeper wound. And then there is the human layer, the part that no security doctrine can fully neutralize. This uprising, whatever its outcome, is not driven solely by abstract freedom. It is driven by exhaustion, by drought, by empty reservoirs and dead farmland, by decades of environmental mismanagement that have turned water into a political weapon against the population itself. When people protest because they cannot drink, cannot farm, cannot plan, repression stops being deterrence and becomes fuel. You can beat people into silence for ideology. You cannot beat thirst out of them. This is why chants about water, dignity, and survival matter as much as chants about politics. They indicate a shift from opposition to necessity, from protest to insistence. At that stage, even total repression carries diminishing returns. Killing protesters doesn't restore reservoirs. Arrests don't refill aquifers. Fear doesn't irrigate fields. And that is the regime's deepest vulnerability. Because legitimacy, once lost, can sometimes be rebuilt. But survival legitimacy, the belief that a system can keep people alive, is unforgiving. When that collapses, obedience becomes irrational. What we are watching is not just a political confrontation, it is a stress test of whether a state designed for control can function under conditions of ecological, economic, and psychological breakdown simultaneously. History shows that very few can. Whether this moment ends in transformation, brutal restoration, or prolonged instability remains uncertain. Revolutions fail all the time, but systems rarely emerge unchanged from pressures like this. And that may be the most important point of all. Even if the regime survives, it will not survive the same. And even if the streets fall quiet, the logic that brought people there will not disappear. Because once a population learns that power can stumble, that the machine can stall, that knowledge doesn't reset, it waits. What ultimately decides moments like this is not spectacle, but meaning. Not how loud the streets are, but what the streets have come to represent, to the people inside the system and to the world watching from the outside. Because when a regime is forced to govern through darkness, through silence, through the threat of annihilation rather than consent, it has already lost the argument that keeps it alive. This is the moral core of what is happening now. A state that must shut down the internet to survive is not exercising sovereignty, it is admitting fragility. A government that responds to crowds with blackout protocols and existential threats is not projecting strength, it is revealing fear. And a system that invokes nuclear escalation to deter its own population is no longer operating in the realm of politics at all. It is operating in desperation. Reports suggesting that Iranian officials signaled rapid nuclear breakout capability, whether exaggerated, misinterpreted, or deliberately leaked, should be read not as a show of confidence, but as a last resort intimidation tactic. It is the language of a regime trying to scare the world into freezing time while it regains control. But the problem with that strategy is simple. It only works if the world believes the regime still controls its own future. Increasingly, that assumption is in doubt. International responses, particularly from Western capitals, have shifted tone. Statements are sharper. Warnings are more explicit. Military movements reported by open-source analysts, transport aircraft, elevated readiness, repositioning, may or may not signal imminent action. But they do signal something else just as important: attention. And attention is dangerous for collapsing systems. For decades, the Iranian regime survived by positioning itself as too entrenched to challenge, too costly to confront, too complicated to replace. That narrative depended on predictability, on the idea that however brutal or dysfunctional the system was, it was stable. What is unfolding now punctures that myth, because instability at this scale doesn't stay domestic. It radiates outward, touching every structure that depended on Iran as a pillar. For Moscow, the implications are severe. Iran has functioned as a strategic rear base, a supplier, a sanctions evasion partner, a logistical corridor. If unrest disrupts that role, Russia doesn't just lose materiel, it loses redundancy. And in a prolonged conflict environment, redundancy is survival. Reports of Iranian-linked supply chains stalling or becoming unreliable would force Moscow into harder choices elsewhere, choices it can ill afford. For Beijing, the anxiety is quieter but deeper. China's energy strategy relies on predictability, volume, and political insulation. Iranian oil, discounted, sanctioned, yuan-denominated, has been a cornerstone of that model. Prolonged instability or a regime realignment would rupture that equation. Energy insecurity doesn't announce itself with explosions. It announces itself with recalculations, rerouted tankers, higher prices, strategic vulnerability. And then there is the regional architecture. Iran is not just a state, it is the financial and logistical heart of an entire network of aligned non-state actors. Remove or weaken that heart, and the extremities suffer. Funding dries up, coordination falters, operational tempo slows. This isn't ideology, it's logistics. Groups that rely on Iranian support are oxygen-dependent, disrupt the supply, and influence fades fast. That alone explains why developments in Tehran are being monitored so intensely from Beirut to Baghdad to Sana'a. But none of this external analysis matters if it misses the central truth. This uprising, whatever its outcome, is not primarily about geopolitics. That is the consequence, not the cause. The cause is dignity colliding with exhaustion. Decades of economic compression, years of water mismanagement, a generation raised under sanctions, surveillance, and shrinking horizons. A population repeatedly told to endure sacrifice for ideology, while elites insulated themselves from consequence. At some point, obedience stops making sense. The chants, the symbols, the flags replacing state iconography, these are not nostalgic gestures. They are declarations of rejection. They say, we no longer accept the story you tell about who we are and why you rule us. That is why symbolism matters so much in moments like this. When statues are defaced, when alternative flags rise, when slogans invoke pre-regime identity, it signals something deeper than protest. It signals an attempt to reclaim authorship of national meaning. Authoritarian systems can survive on popularity. They struggle to survive irrelevance. And now the regime faces its most dangerous dilemma. Repression risks accelerating collapse by widening fractures inside the security apparatus and internationalizing the crisis. Restraint risks emboldening the streets and normalizing defiance. There is no clean option left, only damage control. That is what systemic failure looks like, not chaos, but narrowing choices. History is littered with moments like this that did not end the way participants hoped. Revolutions are betrayed, uprisings are crushed, power often reasserts itself with terrifying force. No outcome is guaranteed. But history is also clear about one thing. Once fear changes hands, it never fully returns to its original owner. The people who stepped into the streets, who blocked highways, who stood in front of armored vehicles, who watched the internet go dark and stayed anyway, they do not forget that experience. Even if order is restored, it will be restored over a society that knows the regime can bleed. And regimes that bleed are never the same. What we are witnessing is not simply a challenge to authority, it is a challenge to inevitability, to the idea that this system, exactly as it is, will rule indefinitely. That idea is gone now. Whatever happens next, compromise, crackdown, transformation, or prolonged instability, the spell has been broken. The architecture of fear has been exposed as conditional. And once conditions change, power must renegotiate its existence. That is the quiet truth beneath the noise. The blackout was meant to hide violence. Instead, it illuminated weakness. The threats were meant to deter. Instead, they revealed panic. The darkness was meant to smother resistance. Instead, it showed how little light the system actually produces. And that is why this moment matters. Because the lights that went out were not the country's future. They were the last illusion holding the regime together.